Hi guys, Tristan here from Pain Free Fitness, and welcome to my webinar on running, and of course, more importantly, how to run faster or more economically, as I like to say, and remaining injury free. So this webinar is for you if you, of course, do struggle with niggly little injuries from running, or you really enjoy the process of running, but it just seems really difficult for what should be a natural movement and something that we were designed to do. You might feel sluggish. Your legs are always heavy. You feel like you obviously hear the keyword plodding a lot, right? If that feels like you're running like an elephant, and you want to run nice and light and faster and more economically, then of course this webinar will help you with that. Before we get into it, a little bit about us so you got some greater context. Kathy and I run a remedial clinic in Brisbane, Redcliffe actually. We've been doing this stuff for 30 years. Kathy, my wife, comes from a manual therapy standpoint, working with athletes. I've come from a strength conditioning perspective. And of course, the two just blend nicely together. We complement each other's services and we bounce off each other really well to really focus on the active population that want to move well or move better, get out of pain, remain pain-free, and all that. And we love that space because we're working with people that are obviously really proactive and just want to be better human beings. Our strategy is a little bit different. We're a little more progressive in how we treat. And I use treat as a light term because, yes, we do treat, but a central focus on what we do is education. And this webinar is a classic example of that. It's just another example of how we provide information so that our clients are better informed. And if you're better informed, then of course you can take ownership of the issue that you've got. And when you're doing that, then of course you feel empowered. All of a sudden, your adherence to the rehabilitative program that I might prescribe you goes up because you go, you know what? I totally understand this. I can see the direction. It's a clear roadmap. I'm going to buy into this because I believe it and I can see it. The alternative of me being the therapist or the coach and just dictating what you should be doing and not really giving you the greater background on it, it's really hard for you to buy into that because there's this underlying reliance on me as a therapist. And that's not something that Kathy and I have ever wanted for our clients. I think that's what gives us a nice point of difference in how we treat and do things. All right. So the topics today, obviously, as I said, we're focused in and around trying to improve our running gait for economy and also to remain injury-free. That's done today via looking at the running gait itself. We kind of need to have a base understanding of what it is and how it works. Running posture, which is, of course, is strongly tied to your running gait. And then, of course, looking at what we can do to improve running economy on top of that with injury prevention strategies, and primarily from a stability standpoint. So this illustration I've got here for you does a good job of just breaking down the basics in and around what the particular phases of a running gait looks like. And the three that we're going to concentrate on today, because again, I want to give you the basics and not bombard you with information either, is the initial contact, which you'll see in these illustrations is based on this runner's right leg. So initial contact, your mid stance or your absorption phase, and your toe off phase. And these three phases are critical because these are the phases where most of the force is obviously being absorbed by the body, and there's a whole lot of actions and reactions because of that force that's occurred from the running gait. And what better gait to analyze than a 5-year-old, and in this case, one of my triplet daughters, who has no inhibitions, no faulty neuromuscular patterns that have been built up from years of sitting at a desk or whatever other lifestyle factors that might be at play to affect their gait. And it's poetry in motion. If you've got someone that, in this case, my daughter has naturally gravitated to running and has acquired quite a nice running gait. Despite coaching running, I haven't coached her on how to run. This is all her, Samara just being Samara. And you can see there she's light on her feet, she's tall, she's strong through the hips, her foot is landing underneath her center of gravity, and she's tall through her posture. So it's a great example of what the particular phases, and all of us should aspire to look like. Now, admittedly, she is not, I've slowed this down so we can see the particular phases, but she's not obviously jogging per se. She's running maybe at about 40 or 50% of her maximum speed. So it's a moderate or fast jog. So there's obviously excessive high knee lift. There's great heel tuck, which of course top athletes and top marathon runners still do, for example. But for most of us mere mortals, obviously this sort of knee lift, and I'll go through this, if I go get this working once more, you can see we'll never have, if we're looking to jog for 30 minutes or do a 5K run, we'll never have that sort of excessive knee lift or the heels tucking as well as what they are underneath our bum, unless we choose to take up running full time as a profession. Anyway, here we go. Let's break them down. So her initial contact, and all of our initial contacts when we strike the ground, critically should be underneath our center of gravity or as close to as possible. If we land with our leg outside or in front of our center of gravity, there's of course excessive braking forces. All of a sudden, this initial contact with the ground comes primarily heel. And if we're constantly going through a state of braking and then having to re-accelerate, well, that requires a heap of energy. And not only that, of course, there's a heap of force going through our body that shouldn't be there. And that's where niggles start appearing, particularly at ankles, knees, and hips, lower back even, because the body just can't deal with this constant impact and the forces that are going through it. If we land, however, underneath our center of gravity, then we start to minimize the impact forces. We can run over our foot better, so to speak. We just chase our feet when we run rather than this, as I said, deacceleration, reacceleration process. Further to that, I want to introduce you guys to the concept of free recall energy. And this is still a theory, but it's obviously a well-accepted theory that we can naturally tap in as human beings into energy that is stored within our tendons. And in the case of running, I've got a chap here who's skipping because the similarities are there. We naturally bounce through our strides. Our lower legs are our workhorses of running, as is with skipping. And the lighter and more active we can be through our feet, then of course, the less energy our big global movers have to do. Our quads, our hamstrings, our hip flexors don't have to produce all this force to propel us forward because our lower leg and this free recall energy is doing it for us. And the basic theory is that obviously when we're landing, our Achilles tendon goes on stretch, and the brain naturally or instinctively goes, you know what, we don't want to tear this guy, we need to recall it. So of course, it will recall it on our behalf without any conscious decision or neurological input having to occur. And as I say, it's free. It's energy that's widely there to use for us for every stride that we take, and we don't have to gobble up our glycogen and other energy sources just to produce that force. The absorption phase. So once we've made the initial contact on the ground, then of course these impact forces that I've just mentioned have to be absorbed. And this is a critical point in which we either have the strength and we've landed in a nice enough position to be able to absorb those forces well, or we fall apart. In short, the compensation patterns begin at this point, and we start having to rely on joint misalignment and certain muscles having to do more work than they really should at that point. I want to talk quickly about having a foot or a lower leg that is active rather than reactive. And the concept here is that if you have an active foot, like the skipping video I gave you before, the brain's almost preemptive. It knows it's coming down, you're coming down, you need to quickly absorb those forces so that you can spring off the floor before the skipping rope comes back underneath you. Running is the same. If you've got a foot and, of course, a brain that is active rather than reactive, it will preempt almost the forces that are coming and have the stability present through the arch of your foot, through your lower leg, through your hip complex and around the knee, so that you can quickly absorb those forces, redistribute it, back up the body, and it's going to propel you forward. If you don't, which is the case for a lot of people we see in clinic, where, without opening a can of worms here, the running shoe effectively has muffled our senses and our ability to be active, then you get a whole lot of collapsing and our body doesn't doesn't absorb those forces quick enough, and hence the misalignments of joints, and then the problems start cascading from there. I've got a few lines on Samara here. That's obviously indicative or reflective of what I've just said as well. I've got down in the bottom point, obviously minimal flexion through knee and hips. You're always going to have some flexion because we need to put a muscle on stretch in order for it to contract. It's the amount of flexion through the hip and the knee which then starts to cause problems. For most of us, we bend too much to the knee because we need the knee to absorb more impact than it should, and then same with the hip. Ideally, a small amount of flexion at both. The lower leg is doing more work, which, as I said at the start of the webinar, it's the workhorse of running. And then, of course, the distribution of load is more evenly distributed. It's not now being reliant primarily on the knee flexors and the hip flexors to absorb. So what does it look like when it's not happening, it's not working, and we're not absorbing that force quick enough, or we just don't have the stability and the strength to be able to deal with that load? Well, you have something similar to this, and I've obviously fudged this down the street, where I've created a few lines and tried to exaggerate the position you usually end up in. As you absorb that impact, your foot will flatten out. Mine hasn't here, but then of course my knee, and you can see my Q angle from the knee to the hip is my femur is internally rotated, creating quite a steep angle, and my hip, which would be my right one there, is hiked because the musculature in and around my hip is of course not dealing with the load. And this is happening for every stride, of course. So you can see over time why then, of course, my knee starts to get niggly, my ankle or my hip, or even lower back from that matter as well. So, of course, the challenge for us is to straighten everything up and be able to maintain that over a 5K run, a 10K run, whatever it is that we're looking to try to do. Once we've absorbed that impact and we've redirected it to propel us forward, we have an ideal position in which we want to try to utilize. And this is it here. In the strength conditioning world, we talk a lot about triple extension, which is the extension of ankle, knee, and hip at the point of either jumping or sprinting or running or whatever it may be. If you are doing that, then of course you are effectively using and distributing as much force as you possibly could for that particular movement. If there is still flexion at the hip, the knee, in particular the ankle generally always extends, then of course you're underutilizing the amount of force that you could produce to propel yourself forward or up, depending on which direction you want to go. Then, of course, with the excessive flexion comes compensation patterns, which we don't obviously want. We want to be able to utilize the efficiency of human movement as best as we possibly can. As I said, running posture is well aligned to your gait. If you have poor gait, then you're of course going to struggle to maintain a good posture, simply because the body has to compensate to deal with the excessive forces that it can't deal with. Generally speaking, stability underpins a gait and posture. All right? But in this case, as I've said in the slide, good running posture is built off great stability. You need to be strong and stable at the joints in order for you to be able to maintain good posture and, as I said, a good gait alignment as well. And I'm going to throw this slide back at you again because, like we've already mentioned, if you can't maintain a good posture, then this is the fallout of what that looks like. You can't hold optimum biomechanical alignment, and then of course you're not going to run as efficiently as you possibly could, and then of course you become injury prone. So what does an ideal posture look like? Again, we're coming back to that toe-off position now. There's optimal posture for each of the three different phases, and I've just chosen the toe-off phase as a particular one. But as a general rule of thumb, your joints are stacked, right? So you can see there in the more vertical line going through Samara's head, you've got ear or head over shoulders. Shoulders and spine are well aligned and on top of the hips. And then down through the legs are all stacked to distribute that force really, really well. And in a nutshell, that's it, with the exception to making sure that you lean forward. We're not going to touch too much on running, I suppose, upright versus a lean. But what I will say is that if you are slightly leaning forward, then of course you can tap into gravity in itself. Gravity, as you know, if you're lean forward and you don't catch yourself, you'll fall flat on the floor. So the idea being that if you're on a nice slight lean, then you're just sort of catching yourself when you're running, and gravity is pulling you forward, which is a kind of a backwards way to look at running. Rather than you always having to do the work to propel yourself forward, look at running as just a sequence of stopping yourself from falling over and let gravity pull you along as you run. And that's a far better way to look at running, particularly from an energy efficiency perspective. That's, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do, and hence why we like a slight lean forward. Running economy and injury prevention. A lot of the points I've mentioned up to this point, obviously combine the two and talk about the two concurrently. Running economy is the concept of using as least amount of energy as possible to take each stride. And it just happens to be that if you do that well, then it generally also means that there's less force going through the body, and therefore there's less pressure on the joints and the muscular system, and therefore your injury rate or your chances of injuries, of course, then decrease. I talked earlier on about making sure that your foot lands underneath your center of gravity. Well, that, of course, is going to dictate your stride length. Your stride rate will also be affected by that, simply because the shorter the strides you take, the more strides you will probably take per minute. And we talk about, for the average runner, between 160 and 180 is optimal. We want more strides than less strides, simply because that means that you're landing with your foot underneath the center of gravity, you're not overreaching, and you can just run over the top of each stride really nicely without all this blocking going on with each. Stride length is generally a variable. Stride rate can be more consistent, and all runners, generally want to try to aim for that 160 to 180 magical mark. Stride length is obviously more variable because of the various shapes and sizes of our body, and also the genetic makeup of our muscular system. For those that are a little more powerful, you will find it easier to take a longer stride, for example, but still get that foot back underneath your center of gravity. Those that are not that way inclined have to work harder with their strength and stability to be able to gain the power from each stride, but then still maintain that foot landing underneath the center of gravity. If we don't, then of course the foot lands out in front of our center of gravity, and we run into the problems that we've already mentioned. The easiest way to have a look at your stride rate or to measure it is to literally just run for either 10 seconds or 30 seconds, count the number of strides you do, and then either multiply it by 2 if you're going for 30, or 6 if you're running for 10. Make sure that when you do measure your stride rate, if you're not doing it on a device already, that you try to find your typical running gait and also your running pace. So the pace that you might typically try and run at for a 5K run, for example, get a couple of minutes in and then take the measurement. There are 4 key areas that I've found that has best worked for making sure that you remain injury-free. And I'm going to touch on each of these now and then give you examples after the slide. Strength is a no-brainer. So we're talking here about primary movers predominantly. So your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes, all your big global movers that generate force to propel you forward. The stronger they are, the more force can be produced. And then, of course, the better you can propel yourself forward. Stability, on the other hand, talks about those little muscles that help to stabilize a joint in optimal alignment. You can be really strong, but not stable. And that actually, to be honest, for the average person that sees us in clinic, is actually the case. We find that their big general global movers have been strengthened through their F45 programs or their PT strength programs, but they haven't done enough of the stability work to complement the strength that's been created. And of course, the fallout from that is that you've got big, strong muscles that can generate a heap of force, yet no stability to deal with that excessive force. And it's like strapping a V8 engine onto the back of a bicycle. The bicycle doesn't have a chance because it doesn't have the infrastructure and the stability to deal with all this power and force. The human body is exactly the same. And it's what Kathy and I in clinic deal with on a daily basis, simply because of the lack of education that comes out primarily through the fitness world on the importance of, as I like to call it, strength through stability. Strength shouldn't be put on a human body until it's stable enough to deal with that volume of force. Coordination. So coordination, we're now talking more about the timing of your gait pattern and how things might work. And I'll give you an example of this, as I said, after the slide, so you get a better feel for it. But long story short, the classic example of some coordination drills might be your marching drills for a sprinter. Right? Sprinters just can't naturally run beautifully. They do hours and hours of sprint drills, marching drills, as we used to call them. And it's these types of exercises and drills that us as weekend warriors can also do to help improve the coordination and the timing. And like I said earlier on the webinar, in particular with that lower leg, getting our leg to be better coordinated so that it's active rather than reactive for all that force landing on the ground. The better we can teach our brain and our body to be able to do that, then the better we're going to run 100%. The last one there is running. And it's a funny sort of title for it, but what I basically mean that is the environment in which we run. Don't just run in the same environment. Whether you are a concrete warrior or a trail warrior, both have their place, but just make sure that you are forever varying the environments in which you run. Simply because if your body and your brain just becomes conditioned to one type of environment, when you do switch or you do happen to be invited out for a trail run, for example, and your brain isn't used to the volume of uneven terrain, roots that are sticking out on the ground, and the likes of, then of course you're more injury prone and you've got a greater risk of injury there simply because you haven't conditioned yourself to that environment. All right, some examples. So here's me just doing a remaining deadlift, which is of course going to target hamstrings, glutes, lower back, and even down through my lower leg complex through plantar flexion, to be honest. There's a heap going on here that's beneficial, but generally speaking, my reps are, let's say, 6 to 12 in the strength realm versus a stability, which of course has an element of instability to it, or in this case, my legs are bilateral, I'm using 2. Most environments, from a stability perspective, is unilateral. After all, running is a unilateral sport. Have you thought about that before? It's a single leg sport. At no point do we have 2 feet on the ground. So therefore, the majority of the stuff that we do should be single-legged. And the example I've got here for you, if I get this video going again, look, this exercise transfers to all sorts. I give it to knee rehab clients as much as I do runners. But it's an example, and a good one at that, of how you can prepare your ankle, knee, hip to deal with all the internal rotation that comes from obviously the absorption phase and landing on the ground, and prevent it from obviously rolling in and the cascading effect that comes from that. The band obviously is trying to pull that knee inwards, and I'm working hard to resist that by pushing my knee out, have better glute engagement, so that when I go for a jog, of course, my brain's used to it. My brain goes, yeah, I know this position, I know these internal rotational forces well, and I've got the talent to deal with it now. Talked about coordination drills or marching drills before. This one here is a great drill to not only teach you how to have a good toe-off position and what it feels like to have triple extension through ankle, knee, and hip, but also how to ensure that when you have to deal with the impact that you don't then go and flex excessively through the knee. You get used to having to quickly load through the lower leg before then popping back up into the next stride. If I play this again for you, let's see, you're going to look for it. I actually do a couple of variations. I do doubles there, or sorry, I don't. I just do doubles. I thought I might just do a single, but you can take this back a step, this drill, and just obviously switch between legs, pausing there. I do. There you go. So I'm now just pausing between legs rather than going bang, bang, which is slightly harder again because there's more force and distribution that has to be dealt with there. And to finish up, I've got Samara again. So she's running barefooted, and on grass. So there, of course, is a change of environment that we could tap into. Every training session doesn't have to be a 5K run on the tarmac. It can be shoes off, barefoot, and we just do gentle stride outs or jogs of, in intervals of say 150, 200 meters. We give ourselves a slight rest and then we go again. And it does an amazing job of strengthening our lower leg, our foot, and of course our neural system to be active and be present with the ground. We love to call it earthing in other industries and environments where we go to the beach with our shoes off and we connect with the ground or Mother Earth. Well, in a funny sort of way, this does the same sort of thing. It allows our brain to be present with the ground and feel what it should be feeling when we're wearing effectively earmuffs as shoes, because that's effectively what shoes are. They are earmuffs. Without opening up a can of worms there, we obviously need them, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend us to go barefoot all the time, but it certainly has its place, as I've just mentioned. So we're coming to a close. In summary, the 3 points that you obviously want to try and work on is improving your running gait, primarily shortening your stride up, getting your foot underneath your center of gravity better rather than out in front. If you are doing that well already, then you're looking at how active you are off the ground. Are you spending a heap of time on the ground and sort of your foot rolling off the ground onto your toes, or are you looking more like you would when you skip? So a lighter, bouncier production of force through the lower leg rather than our big global movers having to do the work. To complement all that, we then, of course, need to gain some strength and stability to safely modify our gait. We can make changes, but you've got to remember that when we do make changes to our gait, it reintroduces a whole raft of impact forces on different areas of our body, particularly our foot, that it might not have been used to. If you're a really strong heel striker and now you're trying to bring your foot underneath you, well, all of a sudden your lower leg's going to have to do a heap ton more work. So that in itself means that you need to do some strength and stability work through that lower leg, knee and hip primarily, or lumbopelvic, so core as well, to start dealing with the new forces that you're trying to introduce to your body. And then lastly, it's reducing the volume. So while you go through this process of trying to improve your running gait, you have to bring it back a notch. You can't expect to be able to do the same sort of distances and times that you were doing with your old gait. Your old gait was a pattern that you were actually very strong in, but it just happens to be a faulty one where you're either creating excessive load and or you're consuming too much energy, and that's why it felt really hard. So when you change all this up, you bring it back a peg so that your body has time to adapt and you don't start getting overuse injuries, which will come from this if you don't monitor how much volume you obviously do. And of course, like any good webinar should, if you now have more questions than answers, then I've taught you something, which is great. It's exactly what we want. If you're not already in one of my programs with my running or the likes of, then I highly suggest you checking out the website down below. If you're watching this webinar and it's already part of a package, then fear not, I already have the answers for you to go with this webinar. And this webinar just becomes an educational tool so you know exactly what we're looking for. I thank you for your time. I hope you got lots out of it, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Ciao for now.